Hey guys, welcome to Code Decode. In this video, we are going to cover few top common mistakes that most of the Java developers still do in 2026. In the recent videos, I'll give you one very quick example. In the recent interviews, there was one candidate. I just asked, what is the architecture of your application? He said that we are completely on microservice. Then I asked, what are these microservices and what are their boundaries? He said that there is one of the microservice which do some kind of CRUD operations for their client application, and there is another microservice which is a batch job which runs every month to delete some records from the database. Now, my question is, do we really need a microservice for a batch job that runs such less frequency and has a common database shared between two microservices? So, when I asked which database does it delete the record from, so it says the previous microservice which does the CRUD. The same database is shared across the CRUD microservice and the batch job microservice. Is this the right thing to do? Was there a right decision taken when you have decided to just segregate your tight coupling and just create two different microservices for no reason? There is something wrong with everybody who is trying to just move to microservices without understanding the real need and domain of it. So let's get started and see that what these common mistakes I have seen a lot of people doing in interviews, and why not to say such kinds of things in an interview, because that seriously give a total idea that you have never worked upon microservices, the domain driven designs, the DDDs, the boundaries, the context. You have no understanding of that. So let's get started and see these common mistakes that I feel that nowadays, even now at the end of 2025 in December, I can see people are still doing it. Building microservices even before understanding the domain. The typical conversation that I see around is, this product will definitely grow. Let's split it into the microservices from the day one. On paper, this sounds fast forward and forward thinking. Oh, going forward, there might be a need of microservice. Let's create a microservices now. In reality, this decision is often made even before you truly understand your business requirements. What you don't see initially is that in Monolith, if you would have created Monolith, a simple order service does place order would have been created a lot of HTTP calls, lot of gRPC calls. To handle those errors in those HTTP calls, you have to handle multiple exponential retries, you have to handle timeouts, you have to have the circuit breaker. What if the order service does not respond during the placing order? What if there is a partial failure, that order service is placing order but inventory service went down? So you have to consider six different things when you go to microservice, and when you could have done a very simple method call rather than an IO or a network call, Monolith would have been much more easier and much less complicated at the start. When you don't know anything about your very initial domain, when you don't even have the business clarity, it is of no use to add more complexity to the code if you don't know the basic stuff. So what a simple method call could have done has now become a distributed system problem with tryout issues, retries issues, timeouts issues, circuit breaker pattern issues, latency issues, IO call issues, serialization cost issues, and failure now exist everywhere. So your complexity of just having a very simple method call has turned into six different nightmares. The distributed transaction suddenly appears. In Monolith, you were very happy. Everything would have happened in one transaction, where you create the order with method call, the second method call you deducted inventory, and the third method call you take the payment. All that ISET transaction and one transaction is now converted in a microservice into three different services: order service, inventory service, and payment service. And now you need Saga design pattern for eventual consistency, compensation logic if anything fails, eventual consistency with brokers, and failure recovery flows if anything goes wrong. Now, your simple one asset transaction turned out into four nightmares for you. Now, seniors underestimated how hard consistency is once data is split into multiple databases. The data consistency becomes a headache because what if the payment succeeds but inventory fails? Now, these are two different microservices. You have to have events. You have to have Kafkas or ActiveMQs or RabbitMQs in between to make sure that if anything fails, your compensation event should go and just remove the payment or return the payment back. If the payment is taken but the inventory is updated twice, you are giving two orders to one single order payment taken. who is the source of truth. So your all asset transaction is now moved to the disaster. You rely on hope that nothing goes wrong. Then if something goes wrong, you rely on exponential retries and reconciliation jobs. Debugging is now a nightmare because in a single monolith, a single log file would have given you all the logs at once, and stack trace will give you the whole story. Now in microservice, your logs are all scattered. Your one request spans 5 to 10 microservices. You need one trace ID for tracing it. You need one span ID for tracing each microservice. You need distributed tracing with Zipkins. You need correlation IDs. You need centralized logging. One single small thing could have been transformed into a nightmare.
Hey guys, recently we have launched a course covering an end-to-end full-stack application using Angular as front-end and microservices and Spring Boot as the back-end. Also, we have used Cloud to deploy this application, and we have used CI/CD, that is Jenkins and Argo CD, for continuous integration and continuous deployment. The technologies that we have used is REST, RESTful web services, Spring Boot and microservices for backend, Angular for front-end. GitHub we have used for version control system. Also, to make the code unit testable, we have used JUnits. We have used Sonar for code quality checks. Also, for containerization, we have used Docker and Kubernetes. And to deploy this whole application, we have used AWS and multiple services from AWS. Also, we have used SQL as well as NoSQL, that is MongoDB and SQL. On AWS, since for the SQL we have RDS, we have used those services, and Jenkins and Argo CD for CI/CD pipeline. Also, this is an architecture of the application that we have created where the front end is Angular and the back end is microservices. We have used ALB load balancers, Ingress for routing and load balancing. And we have used SQL and MongoDB for SQL and NoSQL DB management with Eureka Server and all those microservices counterparts. Now, this is the CI/CD pipeline. This is the CI/CD flowchart for the application that we have created on local. So this is something, a flow when you create an application in local, push it to GitHub, create a Jenkins pipeline, and do the CI/CD using Jenkins and Argo CD. And at the end, deploy the whole code at AWS EKS. Complete description of this course is covered in a very separate video. The link for that video is also given in the description bar below. And also the link to purchase that course from Udemy is also in the description bar below. So please go and check the description for all these links.
Now, why this mistake survives among such a big enterprise applications and with such a high enterprise level senior developers also? Because now microservices are trained. Microservices are so much talked about in all conferences, tech talks, everywhere. It is now a buzzword all around the world because it is used by Netflix, Amazon, Uber. But what have you missed around this? Netflix, Amazon and Uber was initially monolith. Then they adopted microservice after deep domain understanding and the scalability issue. That is where they have converted their monolith to microservices. You just cannot start a product and convert it into microservice. Nobody has done that. They have taken their time understanding their issue, understanding their requirement, understanding their domain, understanding their boundaries, understanding their domain-driven designs, and then they have converted their microservice to monolithic to microservice architecture. It is not the day one task they have done this. So even though it is a buzzword, it looks very good on your resume, doesn't mean it is best for your system or your organization. Also nowadays I've seen that because it looks good on the resume, I have Kafka, I have Kubernetes, I have Service Mesh, I have Istios. But who pays the system complexity? Your organization pays it. In terms of money, in terms of complexity, in terms of developer problems. Even the SRE person pays it off. So it does look good in resume, but in reality, when you are starting from scratch and if you are not very clear, start with monolith. Also, there is a pressure for future-proof situation because going forward, they might say, you might have since created the microservice, why did you start with monolith and then you are segregating each service, deciding the boundaries now? You could have done it earlier also. Since you are assuming that definitely you would need the microservice in the later time, in the reality, your requirement changes. Because in the very start, even the clients are not clear what they really want. Your domain evolves. Many services get merged or rewritten. The premature microservice locks you into bad boundaries. You cannot decide your boundaries at the day one. You need time and understanding of your domain, your product, your requirements, and then you decide what your boundaries are, what your domain is. So microservice is not for your future growth, for your clean architecture, or just because it's a buzzword for the modern tech architecture. It is when there are multiple teams working simultaneously, when independent deployments are a disaster and is complete necessity. If one single deployment goes and everything breaks, that is a nightmare. Then you go for independent deployments. The correct approach is always start with a modular monolith. It is not a big ball of mud. What 90% of people think is monolith is just a big ball of mud. But from the start, when you are starting, when it is just a very small scaled project, start very small. Don't try to scale up to microservice and then handle all those saga issues, eventual consistency issues, recovery issues, logging issues, retry issues, timeout issues, circuit breaker issues. Do you really want to get into all those technical issues even when you're just starting with a project? So start with very small. Start with just a small modular monolith application with one deployment, one database, cleared boundaries. For example, you can have one in a modular fashion. In multi-module project also, you can have order module, inventory module, and payment module. Each module will just have its own complete package. It has own data and exposes interfaces and not tables. And then going forward, you can separate out these different modules into one microservice again. So enforce your strong boundaries. Even inside monolith, you can have no cross-module DB access. You cannot share the entities. You can always communicate via events in this, which makes you ready for your future extractions. So be in monolith. Design the monolith in such a way that you have different modules. With a modulith is one of the way to do it. You can create multi-module Spring Boot project, create order service, payment service, and inventory service. And these modules in the same project are independent Java projects also, with their own build.gradle or pom.xml files. Now going forward, when you have to extract it, when the code base is very large and then the scalability is a problem, 5 pods is important for order service, but only 1 pod is required for the notification or email service. Then you can segregate those modules into similar standalone microservice, but start slow. So extract microservice only when the pain is real. When microservice, only if one of the teams, few things is true, then move to microservice. If your team size has grown, multiple teams are blocking each other, there's lots of conflict every day, and ownership is unclear. And independent scaling is needed. Payment service needs heavy scaling. Admin module barely is used. Then you can segregate into 2 different microservices and scale the 5 pods for microservice, which is payment service, and 1 pod for admin module. One size scaling wastes the money. So this scaling out both of them with 5 pods will waste the money. So then you can move to microservice. Deployment becomes painful. One small change redeploys everything. Then you move to microservice. Downtime effects and slow release cycle is impacting your agile and your deliverables. Then you move to microservice. So microservice is a solution to your problems. Microservice actually itself is a design solution to your organizational problem. It is not a technical curiosity which you just implement just because you want to. So if you don't yet understand your proper domain boundaries, your data ownership, and your structure, don't try to move to microservice at the first one. It will slow you down rather than speeding you up, because you will face multiple technical issues that microservice comes with by default, with the saga issues, the compensation issues, eventual consistency issues, recovery issues, timeout issues, circuit breaker issues, partial failure issues, logging issues, multiple issues. The second thing that I see very common is what they do nowadays is, when you try, this is just a code snippet I've seen in the code, that you do a blocking call, you just annotate it with async, and then you are very happy. You says, now it is asynchronous. That means my threads will be unblocked and I can do another task with that particular thread. The typical reaction is, now we have added async, now it is scalable. This sounds correct, but you are fundamentally wrong. What async actually does is, this runs the method on another thread from the thread pool. So if you know your CPU have multiple threads. Now, when you want to run a particular task, you take a thread, you run the main thread with all your method calls. But when you do async, another thread from the thread pool is picked up, your main thread, and now a child thread is spawned up, And onto that child thread, you are now running your blocking call. So now your child thread is blocked. So what you have thought with async is, now I'm using scalability is not true, because you are still blocking. You're not blocking the main thread, but you're blocking the child thread. So you moved simply the blocking work from a main thread to a child thread. But blocking is still there. It does not mean you have unblocked your thread, any of your thread. Now you have, the worst part is now you have two threads. And the second thread is also blocking. So keep the first thread blocking now. If you have to have a thread and block it, then keep the first thread blocking. You have not implemented any event-driven architecture. You are not reactive in nature, and you are not indefinitely scalable. In reality, what happens with this is, you think that in production, now you are asynchronous or you are reactive, that your thread is now free to do another work. That is not true. In production, what happens is, this REST template.call is a blocking call. So your async thread sends the HTTP request, waits idle, your child threads waits idle for the response and do nothing else. So your asynchronous does not mean it is non-blocking. Asynchronous just mean that you have used another thread from the thread pool, which is also very limited. You don't have infinite number of threads, right? You have just 10 or 15 threads with you. Just making it async does not mean that you have unblocked your threads. This means you have blocked another thread. So the thread pool got exhausted here. Your core threads are not more than 10 to 50 threads, and your queue size is also limited. Now, in the production, when you keep on doing async, each async calls blocks one thread. Now, threads quickly get consumed from your CPU or the core. At one time, no free threads will be left. What will happen? Your async starts waiting in your queue, but the queue size is also limited. Your queue starts filling up very quickly. And when queue is full, your request starts failing or getting timed out. What you see is, you have an increased response time. Your clients are suffering. Your requests are stuck in runnable of waiting because they are stuck in the queue. Because you have used up all your threads. The CPU is showing low capacity. It is still 20 or 30% used, but still your system is slow. Now you're like, oh, if the CPU would have been 90% used, you would have thought there's a system bottleneck. But your CPU is just 20-30% used. What you have really used is the core threads. And which is why your system is slow. And this is the worst kind of problem you can ever have, because your CPU looks healthy, your system looks healthy, but your clients feels the pain of having the slow system. At low traffic, everything was fine because only 2 or 3 threads have been used. Everything looks fine. Every test have been passed. Your JUnits are passed. Your BDDs passed. Now you go to production. There is a peak traffic. There are just still 50 to 30, 10, 20, 30 or 50 threads. Your thread starved. Your queue is full. Your queue has back pressure. You have cascading failure. And that is why your code just fails in production but works fine in your low end moments like QA, in test, etc. Why most of us senior developers miss this? Because this feels magical. It says, oh, Spring has given async to me. That means Spring internal will handle asynchronous communications and will leave my threads free. But Spring cannot break your blocking call. What you have used here is REST template. See? What you have used is REST template.call. You have not used web client or reactive call. If it would have been a reactive call, I would be fine. Chalo. In the next thread, you have made a reactive call. The reactive call, what will it do? The web client will give a request and will be free to take another request, keeping a box empty waiting for the response. And till the response does not come, my child thread will do something else. It was fine, but no, you are not doing it. You are still using the blocking REST template call with async. Now, Spring cannot convert your REST template to web client. It cannot break your IO call or convert it into a reactive code. The Spring cannot make asynchronous client non-blocking. And also, it cannot create infinite threads in your core. Your core comes with n number of threads, which is finite, 10 to 50 threads. Spring cannot increase your thread size. Spring can only make it async, that is, run this code in another thread. Take the thread from core, run it there. But it cannot make it asynchronous or it cannot make it unblocking. The blocking is invisible. The blocking code compiles fine, works fine, has no bonding. The rest template is all fine. But under load, when 10 or 15 or thread are all child threads are blocked, you will go under pressure because your threads are gone, your queue is full, your system responds slow, and your production is gone. It also works perfectly fine in the low traffic because in the staging or the QA or the UAT environment, there is a very low traffic. Only you are testing into that. Few concurrent users might be testing. 2 or 3 developers might run the load test. That is fine. Not the real test that is happening in production. The blocking problems are load dependent bugs. So the correct model is, remember, async is run on another thread. Span spawns a child thread. Blocking is thread is stuck waiting for the response. Non-blocking is thread is free while waiting and can take another job and becomes more performance effective. Do not mix async with non-blocking. If you use REST template, you are blocking. Even if you make async, you're blocking the child thread, not the main thread. At the end, you are blocking. If you want to make it non-blocking, make either the use of reactive or non-blocking code. The reactive is the best way of handling it because it is non-blocking and reactive and with back pressure. So async without non-blocking is just delaying the blocking. That means if you're using the async, you are just blocking not the main thread but the child thread. It does not remove your problem. It just transfer it to another thread. It just postponed it. The better design would be not option 1, where you are blocking an async, because it is acceptable for low traffic. 90% of us don't have it. The better option is non-blocking IO calls with compatible future using web clients, using async HTTP clients, where thread sends the request, the thread is released, responses later are handled when the response comes back. The best is reactive if the scale demands it. It also comes with a cost. So use event loop, avoid thread per request and apply back pressure. Use it where there is a web flux requirement, there is a reactive web consumers, then it actually makes sense. So the final takeaway is threads are limited. Don't exploit async. Async will just create and spawn a new thread. The main thing is either the IO call is blocking or non-blocking. Blocking them, async or not, will eventually break your system. If you really want the better performance, think about blocking and non-blocking IO calls rather than synchronous or async calls. And this is the very basic mistake that 90% of the developers do. They think that asynchronous is non-blocking IO calls, which is not. If you want a better explanation and a complete video explicitly on this, let me know in the comment section. I'll create that also for you. The third very important mistake that I've seen nowadays is logging without even thinking about production. Now the teams fall into 2 extreme categories. There is one team who logs everything. It logs request, response object, and headers. Do you understand? Having the whole object even logged into the log.info is such a bad thing to do. It looks safe, it might be more verbose, but in reality it is a huge volume of logs. If there are 15 requests onboarded onto your system, you are having 15 into 3 logs into the system. Your Splunk will die, you will go out of memory, you have disk IO pressure, you have increased garbage collection issue, you have slower response time, your cloud bills will explode. This is just noise, it's not a signal. You don't have to log every request and response. What you have to log is where you are going wrong. For example, where exception occurred. Now when exception occurred, then you log which request for this exception occurred. And this was a response given to the user. But logging every request does not make sense for you. The second extreme team, what they do is, they don't log anything. They see, okay, we will see it in the production what happens. Now, in reality, in production, there was no request context for which this error occurred. There is no idea where it failed, because at least you could have written the processing order failed. There is no way to reproduce, debugging becomes the guesswork, and on-call or SRE engineer suffers. So even when senior developer fails here is because logging is added in usually in hurry. So what we do is we take a sprint task for 14 days. We implement the logic, we give the response, we show the demo that everything is working fine. What is least taken care is the logs. Usually at the last minute of this sprint, we write the logs. There is a deadline pressure that it will be a spillover. So if you don't want a spillover, finish this and merge it to master. When you merge it to master, what you miss during that is you didn't see the logs. Without thinking about the load, and you just have written logs just like that. These logs stays forever in the system. There is no production visibility during deployment, because when you are just in the deployment and development phase, you don't think about production. So in the low end of staging like UAT or dev environment, there is a low traffic, there is low data, there is single node. The logging problem actually shows up when there is a huge load and you log each and every request. Then you realize, oh, your system is logging so many requests. So logging problem do not show during the development phase. The logging problems comes as a problem during the high load factor, that is a production. So in the logging does not show up, it doesn't hurt performance, it feels safe until you reaches the production. And then when you are in production, you are in trouble. Also, I have seen many teams mistaking logs with monitoring. You expect that your log says that system is healthy or not. Requests are slowing down or not. Are there errors increasing by each request? The logs cannot do that. The matrices are for that. So logs are for humans or the developer or SRE people on the production deployment like us. Matrices are for systems. Don't mix it up. What a good logging and bad logging structure looks like is user order failed. This is a bad logging structure. That is why it's always said logs should always be JSON logging. It gives the proper key value pair. What was the event? Order failed was an event. What was the order ID and what was the reason? Benefit of this is machine searchable also. It is easy filtering and it is very much useful in Splunk and Loki. Always add correlation ID, because in microservices, one request travels multiple microservices. Without correlation ID, logs are disconnected and tracing is impossible. So always try to add a trace ID to each request so that when you add one trace ID, all the requests wherever it has went, it can come into the picture. Log the decisions and not the data dumps. I have seen a lot of people doing log.info order, and you are logging the whole order object. The order object might have hundreds of properties and fields. You are logging all your hundreds of fields that this person has ordered this particular electronic item. This is this much watt, this is this much ampere, and all those stuff. Why do you need it? Why do you need order details? What you really need is order rejected due to insufficient memory. This is the order ID and this is the available stock. So don't dump your data into logs. You dump only those things which are required for the decision making, that why this order was rejected. So the production grade logging rules looks like there should be an info level, which is a business decision and flow milestones. This should not be overused. Warning when there is a recoverable issue, error when action is required and something can break really bad, and debug log is only for your debugging. So never log debug logs in the production. If you have your debug log logged into the production, your production will bombard to multiple logs in the Splunk, and your IO will fail. Your disk will fail. So your logging is not a problem until you are in lower environments. Logging is a problem when you go into the production with high traffic. With excessive logging, your disk IO slows down, your request response slows down, more logs are created and more space and memory is taken up and your system collapses. So logging becomes an incident in itself. Now you get a ticket to fix your logging issue. Where your logging should have given the reason why this particular bug has come, your logging becomes a bug. So final takeaway, bad logging hides the problem, good logging explains them. Your log should help the tired engineer or SRE person at 3 am understand what happened, why happened, and why the decision has been taken by the system line in this particular situation, and why this error has occurred. It should not become an incident in itself. The last and very common mistake I have seen is there is something very wrong with this cache. There is a myth that always cache improves performance. So someone just says there is a performance issue, let's add Redis and everyone relaxes. Reality is not that. This cache comes with so much of back pressure for you, comes with so much of stale data issue, so much of cache stampede issue, so much of data invalidation issue. So if there's a performance issue, caching is a good solution. But you have to implement cache in a proper designed manner. Just because performance issue, you add the caching and you add Redis doesn't, without even thinking twice, is not going to help you. In reality, the user has a lot of stale data because of caching. Now a user updates its profile but still sees the old and stale data and stale profile photo on the FB or the Insta. Why? The cache has not invalidated. The cache has not taken the updated data from the database. So even you update your data a lot of time, you still see your old picture. How terrible and how frustrating it is. That's what cache do for you. There's a price which has changed during a sale. 50 of your iPhone has been already sold. Now the user has to increase, or the seller has to increase it to 1000 rupees. But at a checkout, you still see the old price and you get the phone with the old price. What happened? The seller updated the information in cache that now iPhone has to sell plus 1000 or plus 2000 rupees. But you still does not update your price in the cache. Your cache given the old price and the seller is at loss. Terrible thing. So stale data is always a problem in cache when the database and cache are out of sync. So the stale data are the silent and dangerous bugs. The cache stampede happens. Suppose there are 1000 entries. Now there's a situation that you are having lot of IO calls to database and database performance has been decreasing. Now suppose you have a database performance issue. So what you do? You add a cache so that the first call goes to cache, sees if data is present, don't hit the database. To prevent n number of hits to the database, you add a cache layer in front of database. Now suppose the cache entry expires and your system is by chance bombarded with 10,000 requests. All of the cache has been missed because cache entry expired. All your hits goes to the database and again you are in performance issue. So you added the cache, but because of your wrong analysis of your cache expiry time, you have all the performance issue coming back. So again your database is overloaded, you have increased latency, you have the system response slower. This usually happens in production only. So even if you add the cache for good performance in your development area, you still can face issues in the production area. Also, this cache issue is a very bad issue because it is hard to reproduce type of issues. Because the cache bugs are usually never happening locally. Because the cache usually is different in production and different in local. So your cache issue is not replicable in your local machine. You cannot replicate the issue. It does not happen consistently also because cache may evict now and then. And this disappears when you add the logs because cache gets the time to get updated from the database. So a system behaves differently every time and you just bang your head thinking, where is this issue? I cannot reproduce in my system. Why even we get bitten with this particular issue is because cache is usually added at the later time when the performance issue comes into picture. That's when you add the cache as a performance patch, and that too under pressure. If you're done without discussion or proper design discussions, at this point when we add it at a later time, the data is already very complex, ownership is unclear, and side effects always exist. Now, a very important problem with cache is invalidation strategy. We assume, okay, this product can be taken, the price for this product can expire in 10 minutes. But the question is, if the price of this product in the sale time changes in 10 seconds, what will you do? Who will invalidate the cache? Cache without invalidation logic is a ticking time bomb. So your cache works at the lower traffic, where cache looks fine, performance is good, everyone is happy. At the production, your edge case explodes, your concurrency and consistency becomes a problem, and your trust in the data is lost because your data you have updated in database, but your data which is shown by cache is different. So there is a difference in caching data and the production data. And you say, even though I update the data, but still it is not getting reflected, and your trust and in the data is lost in the system. So the famous truth which is always said is there are only two things very hard in computer science, which is naming things. That you might have always seen. Your PR reviews would always have said the method should be verb, your class should be noun. How should you name the method? And the second is cache invalidation. Implementing cache is not hard. Invalidating the cache and entries and expiring them is hard. So you better think why you are adding the cache first. Are you reducing the DB load? Are you lowering the latency? Are you handling the traffic spikes? if you really are very clear why do you want to do it, then do it, else don't cache it until unless you have proper design of it. Also decide who should do what, who should write to the cache, who should invalidate it, who should have the correct data, and only one person should do all these things. Also decide which is the best cache for you. There are 4 types of usual caches. Read through the fetch data, fetches from the cache first. If cache miss, then takes the data from the database. Write through where the write happens to cache and DB together. Write behind is a bad and risky thing because it is asynchronous DB update, and cache aside is where the cache is maintained very explicitly by the app. Each has its own trade-off and problems. None of them are free and best ideas for you. Decide this TTL very explicitly. This is very important because invalidation explicitly can become a ticking time bomb. So decide your invalidation strategy, whether it should be time-based, event-based, or key-based. So if someone says, let's add cache to fix performance, you should answer, what's our invalidation strategy and what will happen if the cache misspike? So you says, okay, I have to fix the DB performance. DB hit should be less. Now, I would say, what if at one point of time you are having again a performance issue when the cache miss happens? So the final takeaway is caching improves performance until it destroys the correctness. Performance problems are visible, the data correction problem destroys the trust. So make sure you have the proper cache in place, proper design in place, proper strategy in place. Go into production, but with all the hands together, that the cache should invalidate or evict the entries at this time, and also test it properly in production because these issues might not be replicable in the lower environment. I have many more things to cover, like not handling the exceptions properly, testing microservice like a mini monolith once, and many more things. Let me know in the comment section. I'll create another video for another Java mistakes that I've seen a lot during the interviews that we are taking nowadays. Thank you.